Good evening, South Africa. We are back. Thank you for watching us this evening on our show, Tell It As It Is. Today, I'm with somebody who is doing the stats in the country. He knows that football is number 1 in the country. Netball is number 2 in the country. He'll tell the rest. Maybe you'll realize why I'm saying only the 2, because number 2, it's netball. He's here with us. He's an agent. He's a sponsorship agent. He's the owner of the BMI States company. He owns SSN. And that company also finds sponsorship. So let's talk to the person that makes it happen in most of this federation and who makes it happen when it comes to valuation. If you understand the word valuation, you'll get where I'm going. Dave, good evening.
Good evening, Madam President. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, and you?
Wonderful.
Dave, 2025 is a year that, we look back and say, you need to tell us and explain to us what is BMI. Because people know that there are states in the country and we talk about states to say, this is the states, this is the number 1 federation, this is number 2. And then when it comes to running, I know, or walking, you'll find that athletics is number 2. When it comes to a certain age of group of people like your under 13s, it's so-and-so who plays and whatever. Take us through there.
Sure. BMI Sport Info has been around since 1987. We have been tracking effectively who watches and who plays sport since the beginning of the 80s, even before it was fashionable to do so. Why does that matter? Why is it important? Well, number one, sport is important to the country. We all know that. But the way we consume sport in South Africa is different than almost any other country in the world.
Why are we different? Sport is sport, Dave. You can't say sport in South Africa is different than any other country because, according to me, sport is sport.
The way we play sport may be the same.
Oh, yes.
The way we consume and watch sport was based on our cultural history.
Oh, yeah.
White sports, black sports. There's no other country in the world where you do demographic profiling of the fan based on their age, their income, sure.
Yeah.
But not based on their color necessarily.
Oh, yeah.
And the way people were allowed to watch certain sports or participate in certain sports based on our history has had an incredible legacy that only now is beginning to change quite dramatically. So that's why it's really important that, especially how fast the commercialization of sport has become and how dependent we are on finances and revenue to keep funding sport, that those giving money need to understand who their fans are, who the demographic profile of those watching, so that it matches their strategic fit. It matches. So we know every sport. We know who watches, who plays. We know, as you say, what is the number 1 sport for participation? What is the number 1 sport for spectatorship? And what does that profile of that sport look like? And how do you grow it?
Take South Africa through. What is the number 1 sport for participation? What is the number 1 sport for fan base? Because we have to talk about supporters. Because remember, we can play sport. However, without supporters, we are basically nowhere.
And we often think of sport participation as only the professionals, only the ones on TV. But that's a very small percentage of who actually plays sport. So the number 1 sport, obviously, in South Africa is soccer. It's the number 1 participation sport. It's the number 1 spectator sport. But again, it changes by demographic. It changes by age group. When you talk about number 1 women's sport, it's obviously netball. Yeah. Many people would think it would be soccer, but by a mile, netball is the number 1 participation sport in the country. And it's also one of the top 2, top 3, every year, top 4 participation sports overall, men and women, which is quite amazing.
So when it's like that, how do we get people to understand that the more they support another team, the more they go, and go to the stadium and watch another team, how important it is for the states and how important it is for a federation to get a sponsor?
Yeah. So I think if you start with the crossover between participation and spectators, the easiest way to become a fan of the sport is if you grew up around it.
Yeah.
And if you played it. It becomes so much easier than to follow it, to watch it. Now, obviously, some people may never play a sport, never be good enough and just love the sport because it's commercial. But unless you're one of the big three, big four, soccer, rugby, cricket, to grow that fan base, to not have the luxury of TV broadcasting, to not know who the players are, participation is critical. By the same opposite view, if you never get exposure on a main platform, how do you introduce new people to that sport? How does the young girl or the young boy wake up and say, I want to be a netball player one day? We know that they're going to see major stars, billionaires that are soccer players. They have a history of rugby players that they can look up to. But if you're gymnastics, if you're baseball, if you're some of the smaller, what we call Cinderella sports that get very little exposure on TV, how do you grow that sport? What do you need to do?
I need to ask you that question. Cinderella sports get, minimal, I want to say, exposure when it comes to sponsorship, TV rights, everything. Even when you go to radio, you don't hear them talk about gymnastics. When you look at newspapers, you don't read anything about gymnastics. But however, you know that there's this girl that came from the Olympics and did well. And then you say, where did she
come from?
Where did she come from? And we start now talking to them. So that question I'm going to ask you, how do we get them? How do we get them to get to you?
So I think to your point, there's a direct correlation between TV hours, coverage through my sport, whatever sport that may be, and the revenue of sponsorship that goes to a sport. So when you factor in that 70% of all TV hours for sport go to 5 coats, 75% of all money.
He says 75% goes to 5 coats. When we come back, South Africa, it's not a secret. We're telling it as it is. We want to know the 5 coats who have got 75% of TV rights, that they are always on TV. Why not the other sporting codes? Telling it as it is. When we come back, let Dave tell us the truth. Welcome back. 5 sporting codes, 75% TV exposure. Which are those, Dave?
Well, it's obviously a big 3, soccer, rugby, cricket, gets more than 50% of that, 60%. Soccer being number 1, rugby followed by cricket.
No. Come again. You said football being number 1.
Yeah.
Then rugby.
Yeah.
Then cricket.
Yeah.
Is it not rugby and cricket and football?
No.
Tell us.
Now, again, rugby is the number 1 sport, if you want to break it down, amongst white men and white women as a spectator sport.
Oh, yes.
There's a large black community. There's a large colored community in Western Cape, for example, that love the Stormers, that love rugby. But the number 1 sport is demographically representative of our country.
Yes.
Which is, of course, soccer.
Okay.
By a mile.
So it's football, it's rugby, it's cricket. Number 4?
Number 4 can vary. It depends on years. I mean, when there's an Olympic year, obviously Olympics get funding. But generally, historically, it's been things like motorsport or it's been things like golf.
Yes.
These things are starting to change now based on the exposure that they get. Remember that if you talk of hours of coverage, where are most of the hours of coverage on? We've been spoiled by our friends at Supersport at Randburg, by one of the greatest pay TV broadcasters, half of sport is funded through production, through broadcast by Supersport. Whereas our free-tier broadcasters, which will reach the masses, have very limited capacity, both in terms of funding and in terms of hours of broadcast.
So you're basically saying South Africans are not giving, the sport that they should have because limited rights are there.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn the tables on.
Yeah.
All right. We all relished in the Springboks' glory.
Yes.
Right? We lived every moment. We know Sia. They become household names, which is really quite a development since 2019 to now. That journey that the whole country's come on, and we love the Springboks for winning. Okay. But there was only, in 2019, 1 game that was on SABC. In 2023, now we had more games on SABC for the Rugby World Cup. Now, just now we had an intervention at the end of last year when the first matches after the Rugby World Cup What happened? Springboks were at
Yes.
home. Ireland came,
Yes.
right? For the Castle Lager incoming test series,
Yes.
right? Now, how many people do you think watched that? Remember, these are the number 1 and number 2 teams in the world.
Yes.
This is a grudge match post-Rugby
Yes.
World Cup because Ireland beat us.
Yes.
This is at home.
Yes.
This is 2 test matches at home. How many people do you think watched that match on TV?
Because of it was on free to air.
It wasn't on free to air.
No, it didn't reach the people that it has to reach. So I would say, if I have to do my guessing, 85 million.
So the average person, and you're wrong,
Yeah.
and you're not even close. But that's what most people would think. 3 million, 6 million,
Yes,
18
yes,
million. With
yes.
60 million support the Box.
Yes.
But it's on Supersport. It's on SS Rugby. It's on exclusive higher LSM only with access that can pay 1,000 Rand a month for a premium subscription. It's not even on Compact. It's not even on Compact Plus. So when I tell you that less than 500,000 people watched the game,
Wow.
you would be in shock.
I am in shock.
Because
To
that's
me,
not the
I said
narrative.
millions watched it.
Right. So when our minister steps in and says
Yes.
it must be on SABC, the game against the All Blacks, a
Yes.
couple of weeks later, right? The next
Yes.
championship, the rugby championship. Now you're talking a couple of million people watching on SABC. Supersport also opened it up and put it not just on the premium channel, but on Compact Plus, and so that they also got an extra 800,000 or so watching the match.
Oh.
But this concept that sport is that readily accessible
Mhm.
to the public is a misnomer.
So sport is not readily accessible to the community. So as you sitting there doing the values and doing the BMI stage of the country, what do you think should be done?
So fortunately, all of this stuff can be measured.
Hmm.
And the biggest problem most agencies, most federations have is they don't measure. They don't have their own expertise. When someone like myself at BMI knows more about most federations than the presidents of those federations, how do you grow that?
South Africa, did you hear that? He knows more about federations than even presidents of those federations. I'm not one. I wanted to correct that one.
You'd never let me get away with that because you are, and that is an example to other federations. How did netball rise above being this women's sport that no one wanted to fund into being a commercially viable with 15 sponsors, with TV rights? It didn't happen by accident.
No.
It happened from knowledge. It happened from experience. It happened from understanding how to package rights and what are the commercial value of those rights, right? If you can't understand the status of netball,
Yes.
who watches and who plays, how do you go to a sponsor and say, this is what I can offer you? How do you know if you don't know what the logo is here versus the floor versus the LED board? If you don't know what that's worth, how do you gauge what someone should pay you in return for that media equivalent?
So how do I get federations that don't know what I know to get to people like you to say, how do we measure that when you put a logo on my sleeve, it's worth this month? And when you put a vinyl on my floor, on my sprung floor, it's worth this month. Yeah. When you put a sticker on a rugby field, it costs this much. People don't know that when people put those things, they're worth money. And these small federations, they think everything should come from government. It cannot come from government. It should come from the corporate world. So how do you talk to those federations?
Yeah, it's difficult, and that's part of, Lotto and funding and all these things. You know the old story about we can give someone food, or we can give them seeds and teach them how to plant and grow their own food. Sport is the same thing. If we can give them the education, if we can give them the wherewithal how to understand, they'll be able to go and attract sponsors. Or alternatively, they hire agencies that are able to sell for them, that are able to package, that understand the value of sport. The problem is there are two different types of agencies, right? There are agencies that activate on behalf of sponsors. You deal with them all the time through your sponsors, right?
Yes.
And when you have very good sponsors, they can help your federation.
Yes.
Most of us don't have the luxury of that,
Oh, yes.
right? Or you have to have your own internal. Now, if you have your own agency, then who's paying for it? So how do you structure those deals, commission-based, otherwise, that allows you to grow and use that expertise?
South Africa, expertise. He said it's not impossible, it can be done, and there are two types of agencies. It depends which one you want to take. After the break, let's ask Dave. He did the 2023 Netball World Cup. The States doesn't tell lies. I always say pictures don't lie. South Africa, we are back. Dave did the 2023 Netball World Cup. And when I'm saying did it, he was the man behind the sponsorships of 2023 Netball World Cup, working together with World Netball. I know most of you won't believe it because I'm saying World Netball, because they are the custodians of the World Cup, not Netball South Africa. Netball South Africa was just the host of the World Cup. So to me, Dave today must tell us, according to his BMI stats, this was the best World Cup ever that World Netball has ever, hosted. This World Cup, how did it benefit their child in Khayelitsha, in Western Cape, where it was held at the City ICC in Cape Town? Dave, take us through.
So it goes back to a lot of things. I mean, let's start with women's sport to begin with. 2019 was the beginning of women's sport.
Yeah.
It first caught fire. And of course, the last World Cup for Netball World Cup, 2019 Liverpool. And we waxed lyrically about how people watched netball, for the men watching netball in South Africa, not rugby on TV. But we forgot as well that how little of that was actually covered by SABC. We have the stats. We know how many people got to see our Proteas go to the semifinal, win iconic games, beat Jamaica. Most people never got to see that.
Oh, yes.
We see it because we live in our corporate worlds. We live in our SuperSport screens. We have the tapes. Our sponsors have that. But that was a defining moment of growth for the sport. Fortunately, we were able to tell the story after, even if it wasn't live.
Yes.
Fast forward 2023, we had COVID in between.
Oh, yes. Oh, don't remind me.
The whole trajectory of women's sport, which was about to take off, got stopped. It didn't get stopped because something went bad in women's sport. It got stopped because we had the busiest calendar ever. We had to make up for World Cups that were missing. We had to make up for events that weren't scheduled. The big male sports, right? Your soccer, rugby, cricket, millions and millions of sponsorship funds, broadcast rights invested that didn't happen. Now, those federations go bankrupt if they have to pay back the money. So fast forward 2023 now, obviously what happens is first the men's soccer comes before the women's soccer.
Oh, yes.
First the men's, all of these things. And then if there's room in the calendar, we'll get you onto the broadcast. Can you go back now 2023? We had, in one calendar year, 12 months, we had 6 World Cups in 12 months. 3 of them were women's World Cups.
And the other 3 were male.
Right. And 2 of them were hosted in this country. We started 2023 with the cricket ICC Women's World Cup, who, surprising to everyone, made it to the semifinal, had a phenomenal showing, which kick-started this love of women's sport again, regenerated. But we went into the World Cup, and as you said, we are the sister to World Netball.
Yes.
And while the commercial rights vested with the mother body, like they do with FIFA World Cup and everything else. And so our agency was very much the second fiddle to the global agency that was to bring in money. And of course, their benchmark was, what did we do in 2019? Well, 2019 was the beginning, and the values were very small for women's sport. It hadn't got to the level. So now if you were a sponsor in 2019, you're used to paying this. And let's say, for argument, it's 1 million. Now, as a company, you're prepared to pay maybe 2, maybe 3 from 1, not 20, not 30. But the sport in 4 years and the growth and the World Cup and the commercialization had gone so far that we on this side, who have to push so much harder than the UK because we don't get the money in pounds from tickets, we don't have the same licensing and merchandising, we don't have the same sources of income. We have to sweat sponsorship and we have to say split broadcast rights. And so fundamentally, the biggest change we did, which you can do in women's sports still and not necessarily men's, is we said we have to throw out the playbook and change the way the broadcast rights are being done. Number one, we have to make it accessible to all South Africans because it's in South African. 17.8 million South Africans watched the Netball World Cup in this country.
Come again. You said rugby when it played Ireland, it was 500 people watching.
500,000, yeah.
500,000 people watching that. You're saying the World Cup was watched by how many people?
17.8 million South Africans watched the Netball World Cup. That's just in South Africa. Globally, it was over 34 million.
Globally, it was over 34 million that we had those people watching the Netball World Cup. Did that happen in 2019?
3.7 million
in 2019
in the UK.
In the UK.
Which is a much bigger market than us. Sky, BBC, 3.7 million to 17.48, whatever.
You can't compare the two. No, you can't.
I mean, 300, 400, 500% increase on World Cups.
That is there.
11.7 million versus plus 30, 40 million.
Yes.
Globally. All right. Then here's, and I say this because, Madam President, you're also the president of Africa.
Oh,
Netball.
yes.
We asked, and our partners at SuperSport accommodated, saying, for any other region that made the Netball World Cup, and we had 3 other countries, 4 from Africa, those 3 regions, they must get their games on their home country free-to-air channel.
People don't know that.
No.
I know that people don't know that Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, people in Malawi were watching from SuperSport for free. Because of we negotiated that to do that to happen so as people can watch their own home teams.
But also on their national broadcaster, on their SABC. They got to watch it, which makes it more accessible, right?
And SuperSport and SABC.
Plus, right?
And people must understand that the World Cup was broadcast on SuperSport and SABC Plus.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, long story short, the most amazing stat is the audiences for the rest of Africa were larger than the biggest netball markets outside of South Africa. Larger than England, New Zealand, Australia, and the rest of the world put together. That is the beginning of changing the commercial value. That is the beginning of building accessibility, making stars in the rest of Africa, that the young boy child, the young girl child can aspire to this, to grow that return. The media ROI for the sponsors was something we've never heard about.
Yes.
Telkom had the highest media ROI together with Spar of any sponsor in South Africa in 2023, outperforming rugby and soccer sponsors. These numbers are unheard of.
They are you know, that is my problem.
And that's only here.
That we have so much information that we can talk about, but these things are not heard of. And, you know, the problem is we've got so limited time when it comes to TV and TV coverage and talking about these things to say, you might look at netball and say it's a Cinderella sport. However, it's doing so well, beating even world federations in hosting a World Cup, beating other powerhouses of netball in hosting World Cups. So to us is when we work together and we acknowledge where we come from and what we cannot do and get people like Dave who can help you as small federation and so-called Cinderella federations to come and help you. I think South Africa, we can move forward. We need to engage government. We need to engage SASCOC. We need to engage as federations. This thing of working in silos is not going to build this country. Together, we stand. Divided, we fall. On that note, let's see you on the next episode. We thank Dave for coming and for being with us this evening. Thank you so much, South Africa. Let's meet when we talk to the governing body of South Africa, the first vice president of SASCOC. I wonder if you know who she is.